police are supposed to give before taping begins, or do they not give it, or who knows? What's released to the public, and what are the conditions and when that will happen? What's the protocol for archiving and ensuring that this data is secure? These are all big questions that raise a lot of issues. How do you make sure the tapes aren't altered digitally, and so forth? And we believe that in order to deal fairly with these issues, minimize the corporate risk that this report talks about, that in fact, and also to protect the public, we think the board should be getting a full report on the pilot project about body cameras before it goes any further. So that you can actually fully understand, the public can understand it, we can know what it is we expect, so that in fact we can't come forward and say, you never told us this is going to happen, and so forth. So we would ask you to get that report before the pilot project continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there a question?
I mean, I probably take on board some of the comments, Mr. Sewell, that you made, or the questions you raised. I just want to be clear on pilot projects underway, and I want to be clear on what you were asking us to do, because I think I might agree with it, but I just wasn't clear on it in terms of what report you want when.
Well, we think there should be a report as soon as possible, what the terms of reference are, so we have a full understanding of what it's about. If you're telling me you can't call, you don't want to stop it now that it's underway, that's fine. Make sure the report then comes forward at the next board meeting.
So what you're saying is, in order to be able to evaluate the pilot project properly, you would need to take into account a number of the things you talked about in terms of community engagements and so on, and make sure that the pilot project either incorporated or deliberately didn't.
That's right. And then we can say, oh yeah, okay, that's why it's going this way. Fine, understand that. Just that we don't know any of those questions. And so, and if they aren't addressed, then in fact, whatever the results of the pilot project are going to be very questionable. People are going to say, yeah, you didn't consider this, well, etc. So getting that kind of report as soon as possible, it seems to us, is very important for the board to grab hold of the issue and say, yep, this is all going in exactly the direction, and the rest of the world, I mean, we can comment as well to say, yes, we agree, or whatever it is. So it's not as though I'm saying, don't do a pilot project. Our organization believes a pilot project is a really smart idea, but we'd like to know what the terms of reference are. We think other people would, to make sure it's a really good pilot project. I mean, our organization believes that what the Toronto Police Force does in terms of a good pilot project is something that's going to be taken by every other police force in Canada and used. So let's do it right, because we're in a leadership position on this one.
I'll perhaps have a question of our own.
Any other questions of Mr. Sewell? Not a question. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Sewell. Okay, so we have the report on the item in front of you.
Well, of course, it's a different report in front of us, but I think Mr. Sewell has raised some questions that I would just like to hear, perhaps a response from our own staff, because I think our level of knowledge about the terms of reference and the conduct of the pilot project is limited, and I'm quite prepared to say so, and just would love to know how many of the kinds of things he talked about, because I think he's right. I mean, before you can, so I just want to ask somebody about that, and I'm closing that question. And you have to whether it's chief or...
The chair, let me just weigh in on this. That's exactly where I want to go as well. I think that body cameras are coming, obviously. We've put a pilot project in place. We need to get updated. We need to listen to what Mr. Sewell is talking about, because I do believe that it creates transparency in policing, but we've got to consider exactly how it goes forward and what it's used for, and what the limitations are. And the more we can bring it out and be able to talk about it, I think the better it is. So I would love to get an update from the chief and the staff as well.
I agree with both of you, because I've said this before as well, on behalf of the serious policy implications.
But it does create the transparency.
Absolutely.
Right.
But to understand those implications, and then, like everybody else, what I've read in the newspapers, do raise some questions about the scope of the pilot, what will be incorporated, what will not be incorporated, I'm not very clear about. So, like my other colleagues, I would love to hear some detailed information.
So, Are we still in questions of staff?
Yes.
Okay, so for, I wonder, because I'm sorry to be a procedural stickler, but we may be able to get all the questions we need answered right here and now. Maybe this report we don't need to order. So who am I asking these questions of? Am I asking the questions of the chief?
You always ask questions of the chief. Chief will decide.
Okay, so I know that the pilot was developed, already working with the privacy commissioner, it's come up at PACER meetings and such. So the question is, if we worked with the privacy commissioner, if we worked with I think we worked with human rights, if we did, were terms of reference set down on paper? Is there an operational guideline that you're working with based on that? And is it a simple matter, if that report is a simple matter of just providing us with that on paper reference, then that's an easy report to write. But do those exist? Was that all worked out and put in writing?
What I can do, I'll have Staff Superintendent Russell, I believe, come up, but just before he begins, this was a project that we knew the level of importance for this type of project, and we did not work in a silo with this thing. And you're correct, Council, we worked with the IPC, we worked with Human Rights, we also worked with the Ministry of the Attorney General's office, went to different stations across North America to find out what their best practices were and tried to figure out how we could incorporate the best practice here in Toronto. If Staff Superintendent can just further expand, that would be great.
Is it
Yeah, that's correct.
Yes.
Now. Good afternoon, Chair and members of the board. We have consulted in a very comprehensive way with the Ministry of the Attorney General, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the province, Ontario Human Rights Commission, internal stakeholders of the Toronto Police Service. We've had extensive consultations with members of the public, with different community groups and consultative committees that we deal with on a regular basis. We have also consulted with our Toronto Police Association. Collectively, we've created a pilot project procedure and guidelines and instructions and training for all of our officers that have been guided in our training as well through the Ministry of the Attorney General. So we have a very comprehensive and detailed set of terms of reference and a complete operational plan for this pilot project.
Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry, can I finish? I need to know the rules here. So I'm asking questions of staff, do I get a set number of minutes to ask questions of staff, or it's one at a time?
This is not city council, we do not follow.
I know it's not city council, that's why I need to know the rules here. If I start asking questions of staff, what are the rules?
The rules are you ask the chair that you wish to speak, but if you don't have your head turned towards the chair, how can you would know?
Okay, so could I just follow a logical line here and ask a few questions? I promise not to take too much time. Okay, thank you. Okay, so having done all that, there's a thing called the pilot project procedure. So if I could, theoretically, suppose we don't move anything today, but we've heard concerns from the community. If we didn't move any motions today, what is the plan? How long is the pilot? When is it over? And when you report back, how much of this would actually be there for us in a public report when you report back?
Okay, there's a number of things within your question,
Yeah.
but officially the pilot project begins on Monday, May the 18th. There are 4 different units within the service that are going to be outfitted with cameras for the officers. A total of 100 officers will be issued the cameras within the city, but working within different locations within the city. That project will continue until the end of March 2016. There's an evaluation program that has been developed through our Strategy Management Office on the service in consultation with academic independents from outside of our service to help us with that particular evaluation. That we will conduct the evaluation and report back to the Toronto Police Service Board, Chief, and the command in terms of the findings from that evaluation and any recommendations that might further an implementation in a much broader way than a small pilot.
Okay, and so the first report we get would be, if we follow the current procedure, the first report we'll get would not be until after this finish date of March 16th?
The fullest report in terms of the evaluation itself will be provided to the chief, command, and the board in June of 2016. So the project ends March 2016. By the time the report is completed with recommendations, etc., it will be provided by June 2016. There will be ongoing updates provided to the chief and the command in terms of this project as we progress throughout the year.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Could I just ask you, what do you think there's any utility in terms of transparency and public understanding of what's going on at this stage, recognizing what you said about who the reports will go to have somewhat more information in the public domain? Because I think very little of what you described, the guidelines, the procedures, and this and that, are in the public domain. For example, I, as a public office holder, was asked a question about what I thought about the fact that cameras are to be turned on and off at different points in time. And even if I wasn't on the police services board, I only was able to give my opinion as opposed to an informed opinion. So I didn't really know what the deal was. But I think to Mr. Sewell's point, which I trust you heard, I would just ask you if you think that in the context of the public's ultimate consumption of the report when written and when it comes here and ultimately become public, that it might be useful for people to know now, including people who encounter the police, people who are watching over the police like us, as an oversight, to know what some of those criteria are, so that they're not kind of waiting until March of 2016 or later to sort of figure out how you judge the pilot. And do you follow my question?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, and I agree with your position on this. Transparency on the whole program is very, very important. We want the community to understand what the program is about. We're looking to develop and enhance public trust. So to your point, tomorrow the Toronto Police Service is having a press conference here to make the announcement of the pilot project, to describe the outline of the pilot, and to answer any questions that come our way about the pilot itself. In addition, we're looking at a layered approach to information, so we have a description of the pilot project on the website with frequently asked questions, similar to some of the questions that I've heard today about the program, so that the general public understands this is what we're trying to achieve. This is when the officers are going to turn the cameras on. This is the purposes behind the project. This is how we're going to look after privacy concerns and secure the information that we capture in video. And simple things like you've just described that people need to know about. So we agree with your position, and we intended to start the larger media campaign tomorrow.
And final question, Mr. Chair. Would you consider taking a look at Mr. Sewell's deputation and looking at some of those questions really for purposes of making sure we have the information to answer some of those questions when we write the reports a year from now? But if you don't start looking at those things now, you might be, as he said, say a year from now, oh gosh, nobody told us we're supposed to measure that or look at that.
No, I would welcome looking at that, and anyone else that wishes to put questions forward to us, certainly we would consider that.
I just add one thing to that, that is that if you're going to be briefing the command on a regular update basis, I think this is important enough a project that we would like to be briefed and kept in the loop as the project goes forward, so that we can hear how it's progressing, what the pitfalls are, and also make suggestions. That way you get the transparency also that we're talking about. I think this is one of the most important things we're going to be doing. It's also being done kind of right across North America, so we can be straightforward, transparent about it, so much better.
I would be very pleased with the direction of the chief to make any presentation that's required with my team.
And I would have no problems doing that.
Ms. Morgan?
So my question is around the scope of the project in relation to what I've read in the badge and what I believe you just explained to us, which is primarily investigative. The body-worn cameras would be activated during investigative interactions. And I'm asking the question because part of our original conversation, and I'm interested in knowing whether the Human Rights Commission or the FIPA folks gave you advice which would have made you narrow that scope now rather than having the cameras turned on from the very beginning of any interaction. So that's a question I have what were the considerations into narrowing the scope for that purpose, for investigative purposes now, rather than having it more broadly? And then, to the extent that, and I'm sure there's a good answer, one of the FAQs that I would suggest you might want to put on site is, can cameras be activated upon request of a member of the public? I'll leave it at that.
Okay, there's a couple of things that you've asked for there, and going back to the consultative process with those organizations, we did listen to what they had to say, and we took their guidance, and that allowed us to construct the procedure for the officers to use. If you look at the situations that officers are going to be turning the cameras on, it's actually quite broad. It's really not a narrow constriction. When an officer is called to a call for service, before they arrive at that call for service, the officer will activate the cameras. If the officer makes a decision to have investigative contact with an individual, and there's a variety of different circumstances for investigative contact, but in the simplest terms, if an officer is going to speak to a member of the public for the purposes of perhaps collecting some personal identifiers or asking them simple questions of what is your purpose here, those types of engagements will be videotaped. The officers have been instructed and trained to turn the cameras on. So I have heard other people today, in fact, with a misconception that we would not be turning cameras on when we made a decision to talk and have an engagement with a member of the public. That's just not correct. We will. When we're not going to be turning the cameras on is if we're going to have a simple, casual, and informal conversation with a member of the public, where we're simply talking about some community event from the night before, or perhaps a sporting event with kids from the weekend, or something else that's casual and informal. We're not looking to make a program that is officious. We're looking to make a program that is very much comprehensive and looking to build trust with the community. So we're looking to create a more accurate account of an engagement between a police officer and a citizen. So the number of times that this camera will be turned on is actually quite broad. It has not been narrowed and restricted as some people perhaps have suggested that it is. It's very broad. You did make one other question in that.
Well, I appreciate that, because that's not how I read it in the services own newsletter. I may just have read the wrong parts of it. So I'm relating it obviously to the interactions that people are discussing in the context of carding. And I appreciate that the very casual interaction about what you were doing the night before socially would not be captured. So I'm taking from your answer that you might actually be, in relation to my second question, in a position to say to someone as you were having a conversation with them, you turn the camera on beforehand, or if they say, officer, can you please activate the camera for the purpose of this conversation?
If a person requests the camera to be turned on, the officer has the option, of course, to turn that camera on. And we had that discussion in our training sessions, and most officers believe, why would I not want to turn it on if somebody's asked me to turn it on? So they can, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on the body worn camera definition? Thank you very much, Staff. Since you have the report in front of you, it is corporate risk management. It has many other items in it. And if members have any questions of the chief on any other aspect of the report, this is the time. I'm going to the mayor having questions. I'll go to him and then
I just had one, Chief, which is, I just noticed on page 4, and I don't think there's any reference to it further along, but is this the place where the police service reports on judicial comments? Because we see those judicial comments about police officers reported on the newspaper and how their evidence was judged by a judge and so forth and so on. And these things are followed up on. Is this the place where that is, in summary form, there's not too many of them fortunately reported on? This is the place?
Yes, so Mr. Mayor, at the time, this is the place.
And I think there's not much beyond what's in, just there's a little summary here, which is just says it is what it is, and a lot of it has to get, I guess, be kept confidential under the Police Services Act.
Yes, that is correct.
Thanks.
Well, just wondering, we discussed this informally, because we all said, wow, someone just rolled into this one report, so it was discussed informally, socially almost. But I'm wondering if this is the place where we should move a formal motion that wouldn't, take effect till next year, but that in future, when this annual report is presented, that the chief present it in PowerPoint or whatever, so that we have an executive summary in which you can highlight if there are any sort of precedent-setting things that we should be focusing on in this, because it's a fairly big and comprehensive annual report. So highlight for us things on the plus side, things on the troubling side, but so that we get an overview and it can sort of provide some parameters around the discussion. We're not just cherry picking throughout the whole report, but focusing in where the chief feels we need to focus.
I think that would be, we have done that before in previous years when we have had the chief present, when it used to be called professional standards report. I think one, just an observation, this report is so chock full of information on so many different issues that might be helpful for the chief if the board were to say, these are some areas that we want you to address in particular when you make a presentation. For example, the mayor talked about the judicial comments. There is the area of Police Service Act charges and internal investigations and penalty and conduct management and so on. So it might be useful to say, Chief, in particular from a public interest point of view, please make a presentation on this annual report, but highlight some of what you're doing in the organization in some of the areas.
It is so chock full of information, and while I agree with Councillor Carroll that it would be very useful to get a PowerPoint presentation to highlight it, it would also be useful to get this thing, if we get our board packages, about 5 days before, it would be much more useful to get this well before, so we have a chance to go through it, make the points, and be much more intelligent questioners of Chief in his presentation.
Is there a desire to have the chief make a presentation on this report at a subsequent meeting?
I think that would be useful.
And it is such an incredibly rich report. Perhaps we don't have to do it here, but people will identify the 2 or 3 that we would like to hear about first.
And we can gather that information from board members and pass on to the chief.
So you want to defer?
We can receive it today with a motion that the chief make a presentation on this report at a subsequent meeting, maybe 2 months down the road or something. There's also a motion suggested by Councillor Carroll that the chief of police report to the board on the ongoing body-worn camera pilot with the terms of reference and criteria currently being tracked to provide the final pilot evaluation, and that the report include background on how these were developed.
How frequently? 5 months? 2 months?
No, just one report. So we have a report now that answers community's questions. Sorry, just one report. So we have a report now.
I don't want to wait for a year to get conclusions. I'd like to be updated as this just goes forward.
Is that a motion? Because I would not consider that a friendly amendment. I want to speak to that, sorry. I'm talking about one report. The thing about a pilot, I don't want them to spend the whole time talking to us. I want them to conduct the pilot. So we have this one issue that has started without us actually being able to, as overseers, be able to speak to what they're using as procedure. But I don't want them to have to report to us every month in a pilot that is this short and is, I'd rather they be out there working with the officers. I just need this one report, and I'm comfortable.
Why don't we, Vice Chair, why don't we start with the report 2 months from now, and at that time, based on the report, we could say if there's any more information that we require. So, motion to receive the corporate risk management, motion to receive the deputation, receive the annual report, request chief to make a presentation on the corporate risk management report, and motion for a report on the body-worn camera pilot as proposed by Councillor Carroll. Moved by Mayor Tory, all in favor, carried. Thank you. Okay, now we'll go to the special fund item.